to Here We Are, Brattleboro's community talk show. I'm Wendy O'Connell. And with recent appearances on talk shows all over the airways, including Morning Joe, Firing Line, The Colbert Show, and now Here We Are, our guest today needs no introduction. Hello, Ken Burns.
Hi, Wendy. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on the show. We're so excited. And we originally were going to have you on April 8th, 2020.
What happened?
She was. I don't know, but here we are almost, well, 2.5 or more years later, and we finally have you here. So we're really glad that you made time in your extremely busy schedule.
It's not so busy, and I'm happy to be here.
Good. 2022 was a big year, though. You had 2 films and 2 books coming out, which we will get to in this show. But let's go back in time, because I know that's something that you like to do. And so you, back in I think maybe the fall of 1971, is that correct? You arrived by bus at Hampshire College with a dream in your heart and no shoes on your feet, which actually sounds like a country song.
Yeah.
Or Dylan at his best.
I'm going to run back and write it as quickly as I can.
Can you give us a snapshot of that time for you?
Yeah, I lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan. My mom had died when I was 11. My dad was a professor there. It was presumed I'd go to Michigan, and I read about Hampshire College and applied and got in. My best friend who had told me about it didn't, but I went, and my shoes fell apart on the way to the airport, and so I was barefoot, which was appropriate for that hippie college, as people called it then and still do. And I flew into Hartford, and I took a bus from the airport to Springfield and changed to an Amherst bus, and it dropped me off in the center of town with everything in my belongings. It was like a couple of suitcases, 3 or 4 boxes, and a big trunk. And I went, I know where Hampshire is, because I'd gone the year before to interview. It's 4 miles down the road. What am I going to do? And this van pulled up. They said, you going to Hampshire? And it was this cute girl and her boyfriend, and I said, yeah. And so they helped me in with the stuff, and we got in the van, and he or she handed me a joint, and I went, oh, it's really good to see you do that here. And they drove me down. He disappeared, and she helped me up to my room on the 4th floor, the highest floor of any dorm, schlepped all the way up. And by that time, I was in love with her. And she disappeared for a year. And I didn't see her again until I walked into a farmhouse that a friend of ours had 10 or 12 people living in at the time, and there she was, now the girlfriend of somebody else.
Yes. And then she became your girlfriend.
Not really, but...
in those days, it was hard to tell.
It was hard to tell.
Yeah,
the lines were kind of blurred.
Yeah, a lot of blurry lines, yes, indeed. You came to Hampshire knowing that you wanted to study film.
Yeah. You know, when my mom died, my dad, who had a strict curfew for my younger brother and me, would forgive that if there was a movie on TV that would be up to 1 o'clock on a school night. And he and I used to watch all these movies together, but it wasn't the movies, it was the fact that I'd never seen my dad cry. Not when my mom was sick, not when she died, not at her terrifically sad funeral. But he cried at a movie called Odd Man Out by Sir Carol Reed with James Mason about Ireland, and not literally the Troubles then, but the Troubles in the teens and the 20s. And he cried, and I suddenly realized, you know, life had not provided this man with any safe harbor, but the films did it, and he could, and I wanted to be part of that emotional expression. So I vowed, and that meant being a feature filmmaker. And then I went to Hampshire, and all my molecules were rearranged.
And a lot of that, Jerry Liebling.
Yeah, Elaine Mays, his colleague, and Jerry Liebling were social documentary still photographers, and they kind of reminded me that there's as much truth in what is and what was than anything of the human imagination. And then somehow, somewhere along the line at Hampshire, this latent and completely untrained interest in history came in, and I ended up making a film, kind of the senior project. They don't have grades like that or levels at Hampshire, but you know, my Division 3 was a film for Old Sturbridge Village, and it just, but even then when I finished it, if you told me that you're 23, 22, 23 years old, and when you're 69, you're still going to be making historical documentaries about America, I would have said. You're out of your mind.
It started a trail that you started following, and one story that I remember is you were, I don't know what year it was, but you were very sick with the flu. And a friend of yours stopped by and said, hey, here's a book to read while you're sick. That person later became my husband.
Yeah.
But that book was The Great Bridge.
Yeah, so it was pneumonia, and it was, I'd been sick in December of 76, and it carried over into January of 77, and that man, your husband, was a book salesman.
That boy, my husband.
And that boy, and very childish still, right? He dropped a book on my bed and said, I think you'd like it. And it was a nonfiction book, and I was sort of kind of pissed off because it was like we read novels, we read Borges, we read this, we read that, and you know, Tolstoy, and you didn't like a nonfiction book, but I just devoured it. Like I never stopped reading it. And I walked out in my pajamas to my two partners, and we started, erstwhile partners, Buddy Squires and Roger Sherman, and we'd started a film company called Florentine Films, and didn't have any work and were starving. And I said, this is our first film. And they looked at me like, he's delusional and he's crazy. But David had given me the Great Bridge, the epic story of the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, and that literally was it. That was the door I walked through.
I know that a lot of people probably wonder why it's called Florentine Films. Well, as we talked the other day, I have my legend story, but I guess the reality is different.
Well, you know, John Ford, who I wanted to be when I saw my dad cry in 1965, 66, always famously said, when faced with the fact or the legend, print the legend.
Yeah.
But having gone the documentary route, I've been trying to print the fact for the last, you know, nearly 50 years. And so the fact is that our beloved other teacher, Elaine Mays, lived in Florence, Massachusetts, which is a suburb of Northampton. And we would visit her house all the time. It's famous for a diner called Miss Flo's Diner, which we would go in, Miss Florence Diner, which we go in every once in a while. But we were making a film together, Roger and Buddy and her and I, on the streets of New York, just cinema verite in the early 70s. And we went to the film lab to drop off that day's shooting, and the woman behind the counter said, what's the name? And I said, Elaine Mays. And she said, company. And I just looked at them all and I said, Florentine Films. and because she lived in Florence, and everybody laughed. And we've always said that it was a renaissance in filmmaking, or it just had a lot of spinach. Or what's amazing is that one of my producing teams, and I have 3 or 4 depending on the day, is my oldest daughter and her husband, and they are spending the year in Florence, which I've always said we should open a branch, Cine Firenze, and then Walpole would be just a subsidiary of it.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so that's the truth, and mine was much more Breakfast Club. You know, it was like you guys in the Miss Florence Diner saying, oh, we've got all of us together, we should make a company. How about, well, we've got eggs with spinach in it. You know? So anyway, that was my story. So it's good to hear the truth. And so you and I first met in 1977.
Right.
You were living with Buddy Squires, who's been your
cinematographer,
for that long.
Yep, and one of the partners with Roger Sherman, the original partners in Florentine.
Yes, he did a lot of sound, I believe, at that time. So I met you. You were in a second floor walk-up.
Above a liquor store.
Oh, I don't remember.
Next to the town hall of Amherst, Massachusetts.
Yeah. I remember it being dark and very bachelor-y. That's about all I remember.
It was high ceilings and very, very light. It was a railroady place with lots of, you know, room after room after room after room. But it was pretty airy to us. We filled every bit of the walls with posters and photographs and things like that. So
maybe you covered the windows too. Maybe that's why it was so dark. You moved up to Walpole, New Hampshire, and actually had the whole business, so to speak, in your house. You had just started the Shaker film, which was your second film, and you needed an extra pair of hands. So you brought me in, which was really lovely, and I had absolutely no experience with film whatsoever. So I would log things, and you know, what were we using? Was it a Steenberg or was it movie?
Well, we had a Moviola at first, and then we moved to a Steenbeck. But it was actually 82, 83 that we started on the Shakers, because we finished Brooklyn Bridge in 81 and it was nominated for an Academy Award in early 82, and then we really didn't get started until the summer of 82, deciding that we'd do the Shakers. And it was because Amy Steckler and I drove past the Hancock Shaker Village just outside of Pittsfield and kind of slammed on the brakes and went, who made these buildings?
Yeah. That was such a wonderful film to be part of. It was so long ago. But it was lovely. And going to meet the very last of the Shaker sisters and to be able to talk with them and to see the, I don't know what's happened to Sabbath Day Lake, but the communities, you know, were intact. Yeah, it was a wonderful time.
It's a beautiful place. One of the Shakers in the Canterbury Shaker Village in New Hampshire said it's like a blanket of blessing, is what she said to recall. And it's true. I always have this feeling when I round a corner and come up and see this. Essentially, you're going back in time to the late, 18th century, early 19th century, and it's right before you. And there's most of my work involves a kind of time travel, but you always feel safely tethered in the present. But there was something about the Shakers there on Sabbath Day Lake, where I know you also went, that you just suddenly, there might be cars going by at 50 miles an hour between the dwellings because they're built on old country roads that are now country highways. But there's something very special about it.
And just to go back to that time again, when we were all in the living room of your house, and for so long it was you and me and Amy, and then you hired someone, I hired our friend Camilla Rockwell, I think, to be in the office, which was an in-between room, right before the dining room. But one of the things I think, Ken, that I feel you still really carry forward is a family style of filmmaking, a family style of business. And certainly at that time, I mean, our kids were all little kids and being born, and they were sort of coming in and out as well. But that spirit, I think, is still really there.
Yeah, I would say family, and I'd also say handmade. There's a tendency to sort of, no matter how it is, to industrialize it. I was living between Amherst and New York and then in New York, and we just literally couldn't afford the rent. And we shot most of the film, and many of our friends, including you, were in the area of Walpole, and so we moved up to the house I'm still living in. And sort of we're trying to figure out how to invent the wheel. How do you make a film about history? And then we sort of kept that same, not recipe or formula, it's just the same attitude towards the material. They're still handmade. Everybody, there's no real job descriptions. And people, or if there are, if you're the editor, but you also do lots of other things. And so there was, and the same spirit is still there, and it hasn't, there are 4 producing teams, 3 producing teams, and, at any given time you might have 25 or 30 people working, so that's a little bit more. But the same intimacy at that moment where you're deciding what will be in, what will be out, how we will make this better, how we will try to fix this problem or that.
And the relationships.
And the relationships.
All the relationships between people and working on different projects together. And when you work together on those kinds of projects, it can be very intense.
Yeah, no, it's very intense. But, fortunately there's no, I've always said it's not brain surgery, so there's no yelling. Although I don't think yelling in brain surgery is helpful either, I
would hope not. I want to talk a little bit about 2 of your short films.
Okay.
And ones that are not in the mainstream quite as much as the other ones. One is The Address, which is about Greenwood School and an annual event that they always do.
Yeah, so I was invited, I'm going to make this up, sometime in the aughts to the Greenwood School, may have even been the late 90s, to go and be a judge for this competition. This is a school for kids with learning differences, all boys. And each year when they get back from Thanksgiving, where we are now, they are asked to memorize the Gettysburg Address, which would be a tough challenge for you or me. 10 super complicated sentences with the word here used 7 or 8 times, but in different places, like furniture that's stuck in the way to trip you up in the middle of the night. But for these kids, it's a serious and daunting Everest. And they do it. And then in February, around Lincoln's birthday, they publicly recite it. So a lot of the differences that they have are with learning and putting things together, but they also have to do with executive function and lots of anxieties and things like that. So I just wept, and I went back a few years and did it. And I kept saying, this should be a film, but this is not the kind of film that I make. I make historical things with archives. This is cinema verite. You need to find somebody. And then as the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address was approaching in 2013, I said, we got to do this. And we embedded with a camera person and a sound person and people that work for me in kind of, in administrative functions, Chris Darling, and we just embedded himself, and we finally disappeared, flies on the walls, and watched the drama of these kids trying to learn that, and then filmed the event, and then learned that they had never been to Gettysburg, that in the whole history of the school, they had never been to Gettysburg. So we rented a bus, and I rented the hotel rooms and this restaurant, the Dobbins Tavern, and the pizza parlor, and I took them and gave them a tour of Gettysburg, and we ended up where we think he gave the address, and we had them recite it again. And so there's some really wonderful things at the end of it. It's the coda to the film. It's had this life within the community of people with learning differences, and it's been, I'm so lucky because I know somebody who thinks each one of my films is my best film. And that's, no turkeys yet, or maybe they're just being polite. But I meet a lot of people along the road that sort of feel that one is the best.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
It's playful and it's energetic, and it really reminded us of bigger things. And there was one kid who was absolutely adamant an hour before he wasn't going to do it, and he did it. And I knew this kid was going to come back, and just the sweetest boy. And so I got my iPhone out, and I lay down on the floor and watched the last shot of the main body of the film before we go to Gettysburg, is him, this big strapping kid, but just as sweet as could be, with sort of peaches and cream complexion, just melting into his mom with relief and love and satisfaction. And, I don't know of a better shot we have in a film than that.
I believe that. The second film is called Seeing, Searching, Being.
We were going to make a film about a painter that we know, a man who was also a businessman and a philosopher and a writer, and had become friends to many of us. And his paintings, which had been a kind of avocation, and his second wife had sort of discovered and encouraged, and he'd retaken up, was going to have an exhibition in Japan. And he did a lot of connections to Zen studies in Japan, and had a good relationship over there. So there was going to be an exhibition, and they wanted a little film made. So we made this 13-minute film called William Siegel. And then we would often travel with him or join him in Paris, and he went a couple times a year. And one very, very cold 1995, I think, January day, we drove early one Sunday morning down to Vézelay, a cathedral town unlike Chartres or Saint-Denis. It just basically has very few tourists, so whatever gets accumulated through the inattention of tourism had yet to beset Vézelay. And we learned that it was designed so that on the summer solstice, the light would come down through the particular lights and illuminate the main aisle of the nave. And we said, let's do that, and let's make a second film, and this time it will be on search. Or we weren't quite sure, but it was about search. So we made a half-an-hour film called Vézelay. And then several years later, we had been an admirer of the Zen sort of lesson about catching the bull. And Mr. Siegel had himself painted something that was the metaphor of that, about searching. It's about enlightenment, and you catch the bull, and at the end, you release the bull, and there's nothingness, and the last one is the old man in the marketplace, sort of free of all kind of baggage. And so I said, let's make a film called In the Marketplace. Mr. Siegel really loved Paris, and so we just followed him around as he launched an exhibition, as he went to the market, as he examined the fruits, as he carried on. And all of the films, at the heart of it is an interview that I conducted with him. I'm not in it. And him just talking about the ideas that are animating the painting and then more.
Yes.
And Vézelay and search,
Yes.
and then more. And this idea of the ox herding pictures, and then more.
Yes.
And it's always that more, which is so fascinating. And so, somehow somebody marketed it together as Seeing, Searching, and Being, but it's really just 3 little films all sort of tagged on one thing that are an hour and 13 minutes.
And I rewatched it recently after 25 years seeing it, and it was so delightful. It was so refreshing. It was just wonderful to see it. It was just so clean in so many ways. And he says so many wonderful things, but it's all about, I love when you're in Vézelay, he talks about, and we're seeing it as he's talking about this being a holy place. This was created as a holy place, and it's permeated in the stones. And everyone who walks through there connects with it in some ways. And then later in the marketplace, I love that he talks about all the people we're seeing, they all have a divine spark.
Yeah, that everybody has an inborn sense of the aesthetic. And he's appreciating how each vendor is arranging their oranges and their fruits. And you do see that in French markets where each person really competes with themselves and God to look well, but also I'm sure their neighbors and their customers.
Yeah.
But there's something really impressively generous.
Yes.
He once remarked to a friend of his, the theater and opera director Peter Brook, as they came out of the metro in Paris, he looked at them and said, "They're all angels," and that kind of generosity of spirit about the human race is a, given our record, which is dismally poor, is a wonderfully generous thing. And I think that's why just being around him was such a, I've been fortunate to have so many mentors in my life, and he certainly was one of them. And,
Yes.
And he had a kind of gentle ferocity to him.
Yes.
There's a moment in the first film where he just goes, "Forget everything." And you just go, okay. And it's like, I'll do that. And I can see that film 100 times. And at that point, actually, I get a little start, and I sit up a little bit straighter.
Yes. And he's one of the things, I think it must have been in the one about painting. He said, you work at it to let this other force come through you. And you have said, and I can't remember where this was, but you were talking about how you're a medium. I think somebody asked you about doing a film about your life or something like that. And you're feeling like you are a medium. In the same sense of the word, and I've heard writers and poets and all kinds of different artists talk about that creative spirit and how just opening up and letting that come in. And you feel that in film as well.
Yeah, Marty Stewart, the country music virtuoso guitar player, started when he was just a little kid and had like 2 jobs, Bill Monroe, Johnny Cash, working for them, and got his own band called the Superlatives, and he's wonderful. And he just talks about how, you're talking about the creator who made the sun, the moon, and the stars. He said, a 2.5-minute country song isn't that hard. But you're talking about catching it and just putting yourself in a position to be open to it.
Yeah.
And I think that's, for me, it's often when we're working, it's trying to just listen to the very weak or hushed or sometimes even, shut up voice that's saying, I'm not quite sure about this, and how to listen to that. The weakest voice saying this isn't right, because you want to be certainly sure that that's working, so let's not touch it. And the point is, you want to just continue to say, is it still working?
Yeah, right.
And how do you do that? And it's humiliating and it's humbling, which are 2 different things, and both good things. And you just have to submit to a process, and something happens, and it's not. You can't go thinking about it in the largest, most spiritual terms, but that if you accumulate enough days of sincere attention to what it is, something accrues, something happens.
You've had an amazing track record. I mean, it's such a combination, of fortune and talent and destiny. you know. And I think of that sometimes with you, you know, even back in Ann Arbor, I think you were thinking about being a filmmaker, you know, and so, you know, to be able to have that,
so lucky.
Yeah, to be able to have that come.
And what's so interesting to add to that is there's rarely been a film that I've finished, some of them taking 10 years to make, that when they were released, that was the moment that everybody wanted to know about that. The Civil War, or baseball, or the national parks, or and it sort of, it's some, and I don't have any conscious awareness of this at all, but some connection to the zeitgeist, the U.S. and the Holocaust just coming out. You know, I've just done this book of photographs, which I've been thinking about and working on for 15 years in my head, and with my colleagues, including David and Susanna Steisel and Brian Lee, and finally comes out, and it seems to be exactly the thing that is needed right this second to talk about where we've been in a difficult way, perhaps that we're moving out of, and how do we share the sense of us and know them. That's my whole thing. I make films about the U.S., but I make films about us. And what I've learned in the middle of country music, I realized, oh yeah, there's no them. You know, and if anyone tells you there is a them, just move away. Just move away. There's no them. There's only us.
In each of the films, in some way, you're asking, who are we?
Yeah.
Who are we? How does that translate to you personally?
Well, I think that you can't genuinely sound that question without basically asking, who am I? And so these films are. People ask if there's a uniting thread, and I said, well, it's obvious. They're all about the United States so far. We are working on a film about Leonardo da Vinci, and we'll see. But they're all about the United States, and they all ask questions, tough questions about who we are, and tell tough stories, and celebratory but tough about it. But I think that, you know, these acts of, you know, you put two notes together, and you've got music, you put a couple pictures together, you've got a film, whatever it might be, you also create a mirror, right? For me, each project, because I'm not making films about subjects I know about and then telling you what you should know. The last time I checked, it's homework. You know, we're sharing with you the process of discovery. And then something happens in that where you get something. The projects repay you so many times, and not just in the making them. Afterwards, when I go into this evangelical mode, I'm out on the road talking about it. It's a huge part. You go, oh, that's how I feel.
Yeah, right.
That's who I am. That's what I'm drawn to. After the thing is done, you know.
And it's almost like the ox herding pictures, right?
It's exactly that. You know?
You're
and now I'm the old man in the marketplace. I don't know how enlightened I am, but I certainly am qualifying for old man in the marketplace.
You've traveled that route. And speaking earlier about country music, I read recently that Merle Haggard said, I didn't know when I started playing guitar and singing that I was signing up for a 50-year bus trip.
No, that's true.
And you have been on a 50-year...
Yeah, but it's all right because it's not really about that. A lot of stuff happens on those buses.
That's
Lots of great creativity and songs written, some of them good, some of them not so good. Okie from Muskogee was written on a bus as they were passing Muskogee, Oklahoma, and they were all smoking dope there, and it became this kind of anthem of the right, anti-hippie thing. You know, Merle said in our film he said it's about dreams and songs and souls, things you can't see. And that's
lovely.
That's an ineffable thing. I mean, when you talk about the greatest country songs, they're like haiku. You know, the best it's called the Hillbilly Shakespeare. Hank Williams, you know, said, the silence of a shooting star lights up a purple sky, and as I wonder where you are, I'm so lonesome I could cry. I mean, come on.
The first film you made was up for an Emmy Award. You've won so many awards. You've won, 2 Oscar nominations, 2 Grammys, 15 Emmys, 16 Emmys, a Lifetime Achievement Award at the age of 55, which was kind of amazing.
No, when I accepted it, I said it was in the middle of the '08 meltdown. So I said in tough economic times, I would like to just sort of say that this could be a half lifetime award, you know?
Yeah, so all of those things can, you know, I always wonder, what's it like to receive that kind of energy coming toward you all the time?
So I have used to be on my refrigerator, and now is framed because it fell apart, yellowed and old and scotch taped too many times up, this old New Yorker cartoon that shows 3 guys standing in hell. the flames licking up around them, and one guy says to the other two, apparently my over 200 screen credits didn't mean a damn thing. And they don't. They don't. There's something incredibly satisfying. I was just in Los Angeles week before last and inducted into the Television Hall of Fame.
Yes.
It was a lovely evening.
Yeah.
And then I went home. If you're involved in a creative process, you know, it's just, you know, somebody asked Duke Ellington what was his most important composition, and he's probably our most prolific composer, you know, more than 2,500 works, I believe. He said, the one I'm working on now. So
Yeah.
it's really like,
Right.
you know, I have a hard time drinking it in and taking in some of these good stuff, but
Yeah.
and I'm deeply honored that people would do that, but it's really, there's work to be done. You know?
Yes.
It's almost like moving to Walpole was the greatest thing because it just puts stuff in a different perspective. It's almost like, I almost just said to you, it's, yes, very nice, but there's cows to be milked. Right? Do you know what I mean? It's like, no matter what it is, you still got to go to bed early and you still got to get up because there are cows to be milked.
And dogs
you know?
to be walked.
And
dogs to be walked. Well, you know, I was thinking about this with you because it's been so many years that you've been receiving all this, and of course giving at the same time. So it's very reciprocal,
Yeah.
I think, and I think maybe that's the key to it because I remember another quote. I remember George Harrison after the Beatles stopped touring, and it might have been well after that. He said, you know, the people who came to see our shows, they paid for their tickets, but we paid with our nervous systems.
Yeah.
And you know, that was a little bit different, you know, than your life, but it's the same kind of thing of being able to receive that energy, being able to have it be a circuit.
So it's so interesting that you brought up George because I was out in the car waiting to come up for about a half an hour and reading entirely about George Harrison.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just thinking about him.
Yeah.
So that's in the stars right now.
Oh, interesting.
It's reciprocity. That's
Yeah.
what it is.
Yeah.
David and I read some pulp trilogy called The Illuminati back when
yeah.
you read pulp trilogies, and
Yeah.
there was one phrase in it that said, there's no communication except among equals. And everything that we do, for the most part, tries to put people above, or I'm below you, or I'm above you. And there's only communication. The cover photograph of my book, Our America, is a picture taken by my mentor, Jerome Liebling, of a kid in New York City standing in front of an old car with a big rounded wheel housing. He's looking at the cameraman, and Jerry is equal to him and he is equal to Jerry. And so he is as important as the photograph of Abraham Lincoln in the film.
Right. And that's what photography can do.
That's what
at
it can
its best.
do.
Yes.
It's restore a kind of heroism and humanity to people. I mean, we create hierarchies. We can't help but do that, and they actually are an impediment to any real human progress. For myself individually, myself in relationship to you, and just in any greater way, the making of art or the communicating of stuff, none of that matters. The hierarchies don't exist. And you want to gravitate towards the people who in your life do not distinguish between the guy who might be begging for money on the street corner and the Zen master.
Yeah, yeah. And there, I think, in a nutshell, is the Ken Burns effect.
No, I was going to call that the David Blistein effect, who is my personality trainer. You may not know this, but your husband has been...
Does he get paid?
No, well, you know, again, what is your definition of payment, right? I mean, you might want to go to George Harrison for the answer or other places, but you know, I need a lot of work, and David has always been like the backstop, the bumper, you know, that does it and reminds me a lot about, you know, what's the most important thing.
Love is the answer.
Yeah, you know, I have a yard sign in my front yard and have for years, a political sign. And it says, love multiplies, which is something in the Vézelay film that Mr. Siegel used to quote his wife, Marielle, saying that love multiplies. And the more I think about it, it's the only equation that actually works in the universe. It's actually it. That's all you need to know. It's an interesting calculus. I mean, I've always talked about 1 and 1 equaling 3, and that's the whole being greater than the sum of the parts. But much more important than that is love multiplies.
Yes, indeed, indeed. 2022 was a really big year for you. You had 2 films that came out, 2 books that came out. The books were Our America in Photographs, which you worked on for many, many years, as you've talked about, with your longtime photography collaborator, Susanna Steisel, along with Brian Lee and David Blistein, helping out. It's a beautiful book, and it's the kind of book that I hope everybody gets a chance to see. It's very unique in its format, and the photographs are just amazing.
So the idea was to, what if you didn't manipulate? My job as a film director is to say, you can only look at this for 3 seconds, or 18 seconds, or I'm going to move from here to here. But what if you put a single photograph per page? I've been thinking about this for decades. Like an aperture monograph, and minimal caption, like New York City, 1902.
Yeah.
That's it. And then you just put them 250 together historically, chronologically, all black and white, more or less to the present, but not really, starting with the first selfie taken in 1839, the year that photography was invented by an American photographer, because looking at ourselves is what we do. And then cover the whole waterfront. Sad, joyous, playful, race, freedom, war, everything there. Landscape, native dispossession, everything. And so to put it together, and then in the back, there's the thumbnail of every photograph with a prose description of what's going on in the photograph, or who made it, or an adjacent story, or something like that that helps you. And the photographs, what I want you to do is surrender and say, you can be the director now. You can pan, you can go in, but just stay and see if it can work on you, and trust that a photograph can convey complex information without undue manipulation, which is what I do in my day job. and so, I'm really, really happy with it, and people have responded to it in a really good way.
It's absolutely breathtaking, actually. It really is. The other book is a book on your collection of quilts, which I think actually started with the Shaker, doing the Shaker
I'd been
film.
collecting quilts before that,
Really?
even, and I just love, I think that the fabric is a good way, like wood furniture, to understand a culture. And I think, women's work, the fabrics, these quilts are all made by women, are just much more revealing. At the same time, like the photographs, there's a mystery to them until you have an explanation. With my quilts, there's no explanation.
Right.
I'm just drawn to them. It might say that it was made by Hannah, but you don't know whether Hannah's 14 or 18 or 28 or 88. You don't know whether she's happy or sad, or she made it with somebody else, or she lives alone. And these are beautiful works of art. I've got an Amish quilt from the 1830s that looks as modern as a Piet Mondrian painting from the 1930s. And these are supposedly quaint people. So I love them because they represent mysteries that I will not know.
Yes.
My day job is about solving historical mysteries, or at least arranging them in an understandable way. So I didn't make the quilt book, somebody made it. My quilts were touring, and one of the stops in Peoria, Illinois, they decided to make a book, and I said, oh sure, and they made a gorgeous, gorgeous book. It's just spectacularly good, but it had nothing to do with it, unlike the fingerprints on the Our America book.
Well, they're like icons, I think, now, especially the whole thing of them being anonymous is a really interesting
I love
piece.
that. And not knowing is an okay place to be.
Yeah. You also were the executive director of Hiding in Plain Sight, a book, a film about youth and mental illness done by the Ewers Brothers Productions.
Yeah, so Eric Ewers has been a longtime editor, many, many years. He came as a college graduate, in the early 90s, and has stayed. And he's also developed his own interest in production. And his brother, Christopher, has been a cinematographer for us for many, many years. And they've made a few films together, nothing like what they've done with David Blistein and Julie Kaufman. It's just a spectacular 2-part story. It's kind of like Dante's Inferno. The first is following these incredibly brave kids because they're willing to share their stories down into their own personal hell, which immediately means this will save lives. And then the second episode is watching them come out of it, finding solutions, getting halfway there, and it's a beautiful film, and you meet some beautiful people, and it teaches patience and tolerance and compassion and understanding and love, and what could be better than that.
Yes, and you know, again, going along with many of the films that you have made, the kids in that film created their own community.
Yeah.
They didn't know each other.
No.
And they came together in Washington, D.C. at the White House, and also a couple other places across the country being flown in, and they have created their own community. It is one of the most touching things I've ever seen.
Well, this is what happens. You know, you work on a film for many, many years and you develop a relationship. And so the film itself is a kind of glue that binds the people that were involved in it together. And it's always so wonderful the way I've been able to catch, you know, keep friends from the Brooklyn Bridge film
Right.
until many of them passed away, or keep
Yes.
friends from here. And or the musicians that worked on that film are still working 30 or 40 years later. And that sense of community, I think, you know, we yearn for community,
Yes.
and we don't always find it in this modern world, which is so distracted, you know. And the Our America book was an attempt to say a photograph is not just that, you know. It's something that's seen and looked at, and there is that reciprocity and that communication among equals.
Yes. Well, speaking of reciprocity among equals, thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you so much for being on the show.
I love being on your show.
I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks to every one of you for joining us today, for being part of this show with Ken Burns. It is a new year. We wish you a happy one. 2023 is going to be different than 2022, we know. Stay tuned. Keep in touch with Ken and all of the films and books and everything else that he's doing. And we will see you back here next time. Thanks.